There's a wood that survives underwater for 500 years, not in special conditions, not with chemical treatment, not protected from the organisms that devour every other material placed in the ocean. 5 centuries submerged in salt water, battered by currents, attacked by every creature that eats wood, still intact, still strong, still functioning exactly as the day it was installed. This wood never rots. The fungi that reduce oak to powder cannot penetrate it. The bacteria that dissolve pine cannot digest it. The chemical processes that break down organic matter cannot touch it. The wood is essentially immortal in conditions that destroy everything else. This wood defeats the shipworm. The shipworm is not actually a worm. It is a mollusk, a clam that has evolved to eat wood. It has destroyed more ships than all the storms and battles in naval history combined. It turned the wooden navies of empires into Swiss cheese. It sank vessels that survived cannon fire and hurricanes. Every navy in history feared the shipworm more than enemy fleets. This wood laughs at the shipworm. The creatures that bore through oak and teak and mahogany will not touch this species. They approach it and turn away. They starve rather than eat it. Something in this wood is so toxic to them that they cannot survive contact. This wood holds up the Brooklyn Bridge. The most famous bridge in America stands on foundations made from this wood. The piles were driven into the riverbed in 1869. They are still there. They are still sound. They have been inspected repeatedly and found to be in excellent condition. 150 years underwater in the polluted waters of New York Harbor. No rot, no degradation, no failure. The engineers who built the Brooklyn Bridge chose this wood because they knew what every shipbuilder of their era knew. When you need wood to survive underwater, you use this species and no other. This wood built the British Empire. The docks of London were constructed with this wood. The wharves that loaded cargo for every corner of the world rested on this wood. The infrastructure of the greatest maritime empire in history depended on this single species. The British understood that their power depended on their navy, and their navy depended on ports that did not collapse. They scoured the world for materials that could withstand the marine environment. They found this wood and built their empire on it, and then shipbuilders abandoned it. The steel industry convinced the world that metal was the future. Wood was primitive. Wood was old-fashioned. Wood was what your grandfather used before modern materials became available. The material that had served civilization for centuries was discarded for material that rusts, corrodes, and fails in salt water. The wood that needed no maintenance was replaced by steel that requires constant protection. The Brooklyn Bridge piles are still holding. The steel bridges built after it are being replaced. Today we are opening the file on the wood that survives underwater longer than any other material, the species that the British Empire built its infrastructure upon, the timber that holds up the most famous bridge in America, and the industry that made sure you would never learn that wood can outlast steel in the most demanding conditions on Earth. If this matters to you, subscribe and hit the bell. The file is open. The wood is called greenheart, Chlorocardium rhodii, a tree native to the rainforests of Guyana, Suriname, and Venezuela in northern South America, a species so valuable that it shaped the colonial history of an entire region. The tree grows slowly, reaching 100 to 130 feet in height at maturity. The trunk is straight and cylindrical, ideal for producing long timbers. The diameter reaches 3 feet or more in old-growth specimens. The wood is extraordinarily dense. It weighs approximately 64 pounds per cubic foot, compared to 45 pounds for oak and 35 pounds for pine. The density is so extreme that greenheart does not float. Drop it in water and it sinks like stone. This density is the first clue to its durability. The cells are packed so tightly that water cannot penetrate. Fungi cannot find space to grow. The physical structure alone provides protection that other woods lack. The color ranges from pale yellow-green in sapwood to dark olive or nearly black in the heartwood. The name greenheart comes from this coloration. Fresh-cut wood has a distinctive greenish tint that darkens with age and exposure. The texture is fine and even. The grain is typically straight or slightly interlocked. The wood machines, well, despite its hardness, producing smooth surfaces that need little finishing. But the most important characteristic is invisible. Greenheart contains natural compounds that are toxic to virtually every organism that attacks wood. The chemistry of greenheart is what makes it unique. The wood contains alkaloids, nitrogen-containing compounds that interfere with biological processes. The specific alkaloids in greenheart, including berberine and related compounds, are poisonous to marine boars, fungi, bacteria, and insects. When a shipworm attempts to eat greenheart, it ingests these alkaloids. The compounds disrupt its metabolism. The creature sickens and dies. Word spreads through whatever communication shipworms use, and others avoid the wood entirely. The concentration of these compounds is highest in the heartwood, the inner portion of the trunk. Sapwood, the outer living layer, has lower concentrations and less resistance. This is why greenheart timber is always cut to maximize heartwood content. The alkaloids also prevent fungal growth. The spores that would colonize other woods cannot establish in the toxic environment. The decay that reduces most wood to soil within years cannot begin in greenheart. The same compounds repel insects. Termites that devour entire houses will not touch greenheart. Carpenter ants that hollow out other timbers avoid it. The chemical defense is comprehensive. This natural preservation means that greenheart requires no treatment. The chemicals that other woods need to survive marine environments are already present. The expense and environmental damage of artificial preservatives is unnecessary. Pressure-treated pine contains copper and arsenic compounds forced into the wood under pressure. These compounds are toxic to marine organisms, but they are also toxic to humans and ecosystems. They leach into the water over time. They poison the environment they are meant to protect. Greenheart contains no added chemicals. Its toxicity is targeted at organisms that attack wood. It does not leach. It does not poison the surrounding environment. It simply survives where other materials fail. The shipbuilding history of greenheart spans centuries. The indigenous peoples of Guyana used greenheart for canoes and structures long before Europeans arrived. They understood that this wood survived in water when others rotted. Their knowledge was ancient when Columbus sailed. European colonizers discovered greenheart's properties in the 17th century. Dutch and British traders operating in the Guianas recognized that local structures built with this wood outlasted anything they knew from Europe. The British East India Company began exporting greenheart to England in the 18th century. The wood arrived as ballast in ships, valued enough to justify the weight. It was used for dock construction, lock gates, and any application where water exposure was constant. The British Navy evaluated greenheart for ship construction. The wood was too heavy for hulls, but perfect for specific applications. Keels, stern posts, and propeller shaft bearings were made from greenheart because these components faced the most severe conditions. The lock gates of the British Canal system were constructed with greenheart. These gates operated in fresh water rather than salt water, but the constant immersion was equally demanding. Gates installed 200 years ago remain in service. The Manchester Ship Canal, constructed in the 1890s, specified greenheart for its lock gates. Inspections conducted a century later found the wood in excellent condition. The engineers who designed the canal knew what material to choose, and they chose correctly. The docks of major ports throughout the British Empire used greenheart for pilings and fender systems. London, Liverpool, Singapore, Hong Kong, and dozens of other ports drove greenheart piles into their harbors. Many of those piles remain in service today. The Brooklyn Bridge represents the most famous American use of greenheart. When John Roebling designed the Brooklyn Bridge in the 1860s, he faced a fundamental problem. The bridge towers would rest on caissons sunk to bedrock beneath the East River. Those caissons needed a foundation that would survive underwater indefinitely. Roebling consulted with engineers and shipbuilders across the Atlantic. He researched every material used for underwater construction. He compared performance records. He calculated costs and lifespans. He chose greenheart. The caissons that support the Brooklyn Bridge are wooden boxes constructed from greenheart timber. These boxes were sunk to the riverbed and filled with concrete. The workers who excavated beneath them eventually reached bedrock, and the towers were built on top. The greenheart portions of these caissons have been inspected repeatedly in the 150 years since construction. Divers have examined the wood. Engineers have tested samples. The consistent finding is that the wood remains sound. Wood that was cut in the rainforests of Guyana in the 1860s is still doing its job in the 2020s. It will likely still be doing its job in the 2160s. The material has a design life that exceeds human planning horizons. The other great bridges of the era used similar construction. Greenheart was specified whenever wood would be submerged. Engineers trusted the material because the track record was undeniable. The abandonment of greenheart coincided with the rise of steel. The steel industry in the late 19th century was consolidating into corporate giants. Carnegie, Morgan, and others were creating monopolies that controlled production and prices. They needed markets for their output. Construction was a major market. Buildings, bridges, ships, and infrastructure consumed enormous quantities of material. If steel could replace wood in these applications, the market would be limitless. The industry promoted steel aggressively. They funded research demonstrating steel's properties. They lobbied for building codes that required steel. They created an image of steel as modern, progressive, and superior. The campaign worked. By the early 20th century, steel had displaced wood in most structural applications. Ships were built with steel hulls, bridges were built with steel frames, docks were built with steel pilings. The displacement was presented as technological progress. Steel was stronger than wood. Steel could span longer distances. Steel was the material of the future. What the industry did not mention was that steel has a fatal weakness. Steel rusts. The iron in steel reacts with oxygen and water to form iron oxide, the reddish-brown compound we call rust. This reaction is relentless. It cannot be stopped, only slowed. In marine environments, steel rusts rapidly. Salt water is more conductive than fresh water, accelerating the electrochemical reactions that produce rust. Salt also attracts moisture from the air, keeping steel wet even above the waterline. The steel industry solution was coatings and cathodic protection. paint the steel to keep water away, attach zinc anodes that corrode instead of the steel, maintain the systems constantly to prevent failure. These solutions work, but they require continuous expense. Paint peels and must be reapplied, anodes deplete and must be replaced, inspections must be conducted, maintenance must be performed. A steel piling in salt water might last 30 to 50 years with proper maintenance. Without maintenance, it fails within decades. The material that replaced Greenheart requires constant attention that Greenheart never needed. The Brooklyn Bridge piles have required no maintenance in 150 years. Steel structures built 50 years ago have already been replaced. The economics of maintenance reveal the true cost of abandoning Greenheart. A Greenheart piling costs more than a steel piling at installation. The wood must be imported from South America. The material is denser and harder to work. The initial investment is higher. A steel piling requires painting before installation, then repainting every 10 to 15 years. It requires anode systems that must be monitored and replaced. It requires inspections to detect corrosion before failure. It requires eventual replacement when corrosion wins. Over a 100-year period, the steel piling costs several times more than the Greenheart piling. The maintenance expenses accumulate. The replacement costs add up. The total life cycle cost favors the natural material. But the maintenance expenses are spread over time. They appear in annual budgets rather than capital budgets. They support industries that profit from maintenance services. They create ongoing economic activity that a single purchase does not. The steel industry does not make money from pilings that last 500 years. They make money from pilings that must be replaced and maintained and inspected. The inferior material generates superior revenue. This is why Greenheart was abandoned. Not because it failed to perform, because it performed too well, because it did not create recurring revenue, because it threatened the business model of industries that profited from failure. The environmental advantages of Greenheart are increasingly relevant. Steel production is among the most energy-intensive industrial processes. The blast furnaces that convert iron ore to iron operate at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The carbon dioxide emissions are enormous. Greenheart production requires cutting down trees. The carbon impact is minimal compared to steel. The trees can be replanted. The resource can be renewed. The chemical treatments required for other marine-grade woods are avoided with Greenheart. The copper and arsenic in pressure-treated lumber leach into waterways. The creosote used in railroad ties is carcinogenic. Greenheart requires no such treatments. The end-of-life disposal is simpler for Greenheart. Steel must be recycled or disposed of as industrial waste. Treated wood must be handled as hazardous material. Greenheart can theoretically be composted, though the process takes centuries. The carbon storage in Greenheart continues throughout its service life. The carbon captured by the tree during growth remains locked in the wood for 500 years or more. This is carbon sequestration, measured in centuries. The sustainability question concerns the source forests. Greenheart grows naturally only in a limited region of South America. The forests of Guyana contain most of the remaining old-growth Greenheart trees. These forests are also biodiversity hotspots, deserving protection. Uncontrolled logging would destroy the resource and the ecosystem. This concern is legitimate. The material's excellence does not justify environmental destruction. The response has been certification programs. The Forest Stewardship Council certifies Greenheart harvested from sustainably managed forests. Buyers who specify certified Greenheart support responsible forestry rather than extraction. Guyana has developed management plans that limit harvest to sustainable levels. The trees grow slowly, so harvest must be limited. But limited harvest can continue indefinitely if the forests are protected. The alternative is not preserving forests. The alternative is steel production with its massive carbon footprint and environmental destruction. When the comparison is Greenheart versus steel, Greenheart is the environmentally superior choice. The applications for Greenheart in modern construction remain compelling. Dock and harbor construction continues to use Greenheart where engineers know about it. The ports that never abandon the material still rely on it. New installations continue when budgets allow for quality. Lock gate construction still favors Greenheart. The Panama Canal has used Greenheart in its lock gates since original construction. The ongoing expansion has specified Greenheart for new gates. Bridge fender systems protect concrete and steel from ship impacts. These systems absorb enormous forces. Greenheart fenders outlast alternatives by decades, reducing replacement frequency and cost. Marine pilings for piers and wharves represent the most common application. Any structure extending into saltwater can benefit from Greenheart foundations. The initial cost premium is repaid within decades. Specialty applications include ship-bearing blocks and other components that combine immersion with friction. The density and self-lubricating properties of Greenheart suit these demanding uses. The limitation is availability. The slow growth of Greenheart limits supply. Old-growth trees take centuries to reach harvestable size. The supply cannot be expanded quickly, regardless of demand. The scarcity has driven prices upward. Greenheart costs several times more per board foot than comparable tropical hardwoods. The premium limits used to applications where the properties justify the expense. The scarcity is also why Greenheart was abandoned in many applications. When steel became cheaper and more available, the economic calculation shifted. The lifecycle cost advantage of Greenheart was ignored in favor of lower initial cost. This is the short-term thinking that has characterized industrial capitalism. What is cheap today is chosen over what is economical over time. What generates immediate savings is preferred over what generates long-term value. Alternative species offer some of the same properties. Hype, the Brazilian hardwood, resists rot and insects effectively. It is not as resistant as Greenheart to marine borers, but outperforms most other species. The availability is greater and the price is lower. Black locust, native to North America, resists rot better than most temperate hardwoods. It does not match Greenheart's marine performance, but serves well in fresh water and ground contact. White oak has traditional shipbuilding uses because of its water resistance. The closed cellular structure prevents water absorption. It rots eventually, but more slowly than other oaks. These alternatives suggest that nature has solved the problem of wood preservation multiple times. Different trees have evolved different chemical defenses. Greenheart is the most extreme example, but not the only example. The lesson is that natural materials can outperform industrial materials when properly matched to applications. The assumption that modern means better is not always correct. The research into Greenheart's chemistry could yield broader applications. The alkaloids that protect Greenheart might be extracted and applied to other woods. A Greenheart treatment could potentially provide Greenheart protection to cheaper, faster-growing species. Research in this direction has been limited because the market is small. The applications that need Greenheart-level protection are specialized. The demand does not justify major pharmaceutical-style research investment. But the chemistry is interesting to scientists. The specific compounds and their mechanisms of action are being studied. The knowledge gained might lead to unexpected applications beyond wood preservation. The shipbuilders who knew Greenheart are mostly gone. The traditional knowledge of wooden shipbuilding has been lost with the craftsmen who practiced it. The skills that built the great sailing navies were not passed to new generations. The expertise died with the experts. A few wooden boat builders maintain the knowledge. They build yachts and traditional vessels for customers who value authenticity. They know Greenheart and other traditional materials because their craft requires it. These craftsmen are the living links to knowledge that corporate industry wanted erased. They remember what the steel industry wanted everyone to forget. They know that wood can outperform metal in specific applications. Their knowledge is being documented before it disappears entirely. Books and courses teach wooden boat building to new generations. The tradition survives in small communities while the mainstream has forgotten. The mainstream has forgotten that the Brooklyn Bridge stands on wood. Millions of people cross the Brooklyn Bridge every year. They admire the stone towers and steel cables. They assume the entire structure is industrial materials, products of the modern age. They do not know that ancient wood from South American rainforests holds everything up. They do not know that the most critical components are not steel or stone, but timber. They do not know that technology from before the Industrial Revolution supports technology from its height. The bridge is a monument to what we have forgotten. The wood that survives, where steel would fail. The natural material that outperforms the industrial material. The solution that was abandoned because it worked too well. You now know what they wanted you to forget. You know that Greenheart survives underwater for 500 years. You know that it resists every organism that attacks wood. You know that it holds up the most famous bridge in America. You know that the steel industry promoted inferior materials because inferior materials generate recurring revenue. You know that maintenance costs support industries that maintenance-free materials would destroy. You know that the economics favor Greenheart over the long term. You know that the environment favors Greenheart over industrial alternatives. You know that the only advantage of steel is lower initial cost and higher ongoing profit for suppliers. The wood that survives underwater is still available. It still grows in the forests of Guyana. It still offers the same properties that made it the material of choice for the British Empire and the Brooklyn Bridge. The shipbuilders abandoned it because the steel industry told them to. The steel is rusting. The Greenheart is still there. If this video helped you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every share floats what they wanted to sink. The next video opens soon.